Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're diving deep into a case that's, well, it's heavy stuff, but it's also incredibly important. We're going to unpack the world of ghost guns.
Yeah, ghost guns and their role in school shootings. We'll be looking at the legal battles surrounding them, too.
Right, exactly. Specifically, a legal brief. It was filed by parents, actually, of two victims of the Saugus High School shooting back in 2019.
Yeah, and this isn't just some dry legal document. Well, it's really a window into the human cost of all this.
Absolutely, and it brings up these really big questions, like how do we balance individual rights with keeping communities safe, especially when we're talking about something as devastating as gun violence.
Right, absolutely.
So our deep dive today, it centers on what's called an amicus brief. And
An amicus brief.
yeah, and for those, who maybe aren't familiar with all the legal jargon, an amicus brief is basically it's a way for somebody who's not directly involved in a case to offer their perspective.
Like a friend of the court.
Exactly, yeah, a friend of the court.
And in this case, those friends are Frank Blackwell and Brian Muehlberger.
Right.
Their children, Dominic and Gracie, were tragically killed in that shooting. And they joined a lawsuit against the ATF, that's the agency that regulates firearms, right?
Right.
Arguing for stricter control of these so-called ghost guns.
Okay, so before we go any further, I think it's important to, well, let's just make sure we're all on the same page here. What exactly is a ghost gun?
Yeah, good question.
I get the feeling it's not some, spectral firearm haunting the halls of Congress, but...
No, although...
Is it?
Well, no, not supernatural. But the name is, it is fitting in a way. A ghost gun is, essentially, it's a firearm, but without a serial number.
Okay, so really like a ghost. It's like its identity vanished.
Precisely. And
Right.
because of that, because it doesn't have a serial number, they're incredibly hard for law enforcement to trace.
So they really do just disappear.
They do. They disappear. And that's exactly what makes them appealing to people who, for whatever reason, want to obtain firearms under the radar.
Right.
We could be talking felons, domestic abusers, even minors, people who wouldn't pass a background check.
And the brief mentioned something called an 80% receiver, which sounds like some kind of sci-fi weapon. What is that?
It's the heart of this ghost gun issue, really. You see, before the ATF, before they stepped in with the new rule in 2022,
Okay.
companies could sell these partially complete receivers and frames. And, they were marketed almost like DIY kits, almost a hobbyist thing. But the reality was,
Right.
with some basic tools and a bit of time, anyone could turn these kits into functioning, deadly firearms.
Hold on. So it gets even crazier because the brief actually says that assembling one of these can be done faster than ordering a pizza. Like in under 15 minutes. That's terrifying.
It is, and that was the loophole.
Hmm.
Since they weren't technically considered firearms until they were fully assembled, they were exempt from the typical regulations.
Oh, wow.
No background checks, no serial numbers, no oversight. It's no wonder this market just exploded.
Wow. So this brings us to the Saugus High School shooting, this tragic event that's at the heart of this brief. Can you walk us through what happened?
It was November 14th, 2019, a seemingly normal day at Saugus High School in California. But then a 16-year-old student opens fire on his classmates.
Oh, God.
He'd brought a .45 caliber ghost gun to school, a weapon he'd either built himself or obtained from his father, who, by the way, wasn't legally allowed to own firearms. It only took 16 seconds for him to shoot 5 students.
16 seconds. It's hard to even wrap your head around the chaos and terror of those moments.
Absolutely. 2 of the students shot that day were Dominic Blackwell and Gracie Ann Muehlberger. And it's important to note that neither of them knew the shooter personally.
Oh, wow.
It appears to have been a completely senseless act of violence. The shooter ultimately took his own life.
It's
It's a
just...
terrible, tragic story.
It is, and it's their parents, Frank and Brian, who are now fighting to try to prevent this from happening to other families.
Right. And they argue that classifying these ghost gun kits as firearms outright would put them under the control of the Gun Control Act, which has been in place for over 50 years.
Okay.
The act was designed to do just that, to
Yeah.
keep firearms out of the wrong hands and to help law enforcement investigate gun crimes.
Right. It makes sense. So why do you think this wasn't done sooner? I mean, was it just this loophole with the 80% receivers?
That's a big part of it, yeah. The ghost gun industry kind of, flew under the radar for a while.
Right.
It's really only been in recent years with the rise in these tragic shootings and this increasing number of ghost guns being found at crime scenes that people have started realizing how big of a problem this is.
Yeah. And the Amicus brief really drives home the human cost of this issue, I think, because to think that Brian Muehlberger was actually able to purchase a ghost gun kit online in his deceased daughter's name after the shooting,
I know.
it just highlights how easily accessible these weapons are, even to someone who shouldn't be able to get one.
It's a chilling illustration of the loophole that existed.
Mm.
No ID check, no background check, no questions asked.
Wow. And we'll get more into the ATF's attempts to regulate these ghost guns in just a bit.
It really is a terrifying thought.
Right.
And it really underscores a point that Frank and Brian hammer home in their brief.
Oh.
This isn't just about Saugus.
Right.
This is about a much bigger trend, this nationwide surge in ghost guns.
Yeah, you're right. And the brief cites a statistic that really kind of blew my mind.
Yeah.
Between 2017 and 2021, the number of suspected ghost guns recovered by law enforcement is shot up by over 1,000%.
It's a staggering increase. And it lines up with another really disturbing trend. We're seeing this significant rise in gun violence, and particularly against children, during that same period.
Oh, wow.
The brief actually points to cases in Arizona, Virginia, Maryland, Georgia, Illinois, New Mexico, Kansas, New York. And these are just a handful of examples, right, where ghost guns were used in school shootings. And all of this was in the years leading up to the ATF's final rule, you know?
Wow. I mean, it just makes you wonder how many more cases are out there where a ghost gun was used, but we'll never know because they're so difficult to trace.
Exactly. It's a chilling thought, and it's why this legal battle over the ATF's new rule is so important. Essentially, what the ATF is trying to do is close that loophole, the one we were talking about, the one that allowed these kits to be sold with really no oversight.
So tell me more about the ATF's final rule. What exactly does it do?
Basically,
Yeah.
it reclassifies these ghost gun kits as firearms.
Okay, so finally calling a spade a spade.
Exactly. And this means they're now subject to the same regulations as any other firearm that's sold commercially.
Okay.
So we're talking background checks, serial numbers, the whole 9 yards.
And what are the arguments against this? I mean, I imagine this is a pretty controversial rule.
Oh, it's hugely controversial.
Yeah.
The main argument against it comes from, well, gun rights advocates, of course, as you might imagine,
Right.
and manufacturers in the firearms industry as well, naturally. Their claim boils down to this.
Mm-hmm.
The ATF overstepped its authority.
Okay.
They argue that these kits don't technically meet the legal definition of a firearm and therefore shouldn't be regulated as such.
So it's this battle over definitions, over interpretations.
Exactly.
But the stakes are so high. I mean, we're talking about life and death here.
Absolutely. And the Amicus brief really drives that home. It argues that the ATF has a fundamental responsibility to protect communities, and especially children, from this very real danger posed by these readily available, untraceable firearms.
Yeah, and this whole conversation, it reminds me of something else you pointed out in your notes about the potential chilling effect this case could have. What did you mean by that?
It's a concern that goes beyond even just the immediate outcome of the case. The worry is that if the Supreme Court sides with the respondents in this case and strikes down the ATF's final rule, it could discourage future administrations from even attempting to regulate ghost guns.
Oh, wow.
Or even other emerging firearm technologies.
So it's like it could set this precedent that really ties the hands of regulators, even as technology is evolving and presenting all these new challenges.
Exactly, yeah. And it speaks to the broader debate, right, surrounding gun control in this country. How do we balance the right to bear arms with this need to keep our communities safe?
Yeah.
It's a question with no easy answers.
It's a question with no easy answers, but one that we can't afford to ignore, you know?
You're absolutely right. And while this legal battle plays out, I think it's just so crucial for all of us to keep having these conversations, to really grapple with these complexities.
Yeah.
And to really consider, what are we as a society willing to do to address this growing problem?
It feels like we're kind of at a crossroads.
We are.
And the decisions that we make now, I mean, they're going to have a lasting impact.
They will. And the stories of families like Frank and Brian's really remind us just how high the stakes truly are.
It's such a heavy reality to face, and it makes you wonder, even if this specific ATF rule is upheld, is it even enough? We've been talking about this legal battle, but what about the deeper issues here?
That's the question that keeps coming back to me,
Yeah.
If the ease of online access and assembly are really fueling this whole ghost gun thing, how do we even tackle that?
Yeah, it's like, how do we regulate the internet?
Exactly. It's like trying to catch smoke.
Yeah.
We can make laws, we can have these legal battles, but technology, it's constantly evolving.
Right. And with something like the internet, even with the best intentions, trying to completely control the flow of information just feels like an impossible task, you know?
It feels impossible.
So if it's not just a technology problem, then what else is sort of feeding this demand for ghost guns?
Well, that's where things get even more complex, isn't it? I mean, some people
Wow.
argue that it's really a symptom of much deeper issues, societal issues,
Right.
lack of opportunity, economic disparity, a culture where violence is too often seen as the answer. These are all contributing factors.
It's a lot to unpack.
It is.
And it makes you realize this conversation goes way beyond ghost guns.
Oh, absolutely.
It's about
Yeah.
these fundamental questions of how we even build a safer and more equitable society.
Exactly. And while those solutions, I think, are much more complex, they're multifaceted,
Huh.
this whole deep dive, I think, sparked by this heartbreaking story of Dominic and Gracie, it's reminded us why these conversations are so important. Even if it feels overwhelming, we can't shy away from these
No, we
challenges.
can't turn away. So where do we go from here? What can our listeners take away from this deep dive into ghost guns, into legal battles, and the search for these solutions?
Stay engaged. I think that's the biggest takeaway.
Yeah.
Stay informed about the issues, about the arguments on both sides.
Mm-hmm.
Support organizations that are working to prevent gun violence. And most importantly, don't stop asking those tough questions.
Because ultimately, it's those tough questions that will lead us to those solutions.
Abs-
Well, it's been a heavy conversation, but incredibly important. Thank you for joining us
It's been my pleasure.
on this deep dive into this world of ghost guns.
It was great to be here. And just remember, even if this specific case feels, I don't know, miles away, its impact is far-reaching. So stay curious, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.
I love that. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.